Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Vinyl Lounge. It's a rainy day here, and there's a storm. It's just kind of blowing through. It's still dark in the room here. We're going to talk about John Coltrane today. An episode I've been kind of putting off, Legacy album, because he's a tough guy to get a grasp on. I think I might have fixed my phone issue. I'm not sure. I'll know soon enough. I apologize for all those episodes I have forgotten to reverse, but I've made so many episodes, it's gotten to the point where when I make an episode, I don't always think of that because I've made hundreds of episodes before this. Never had to worry about reversing it in my program. So I remember sometimes, but I certainly forget more than I should. But just want to give you kind of a glimpse of the day that we have going on outside. And it's a good day for jazz. This type of days, rainy days. I love a good jazzy rainy day. So I'll be right back. Afternoon, guys. Today we're going to talk about the great John Coltrane and his legacy record. And I'm going to do something a little different today. I'm going to kind of iron out what his legacy record is while I talk to you guys. And it's a difficult choice. And a guy who has 65, 75 records under his name. And again, that's a little bit unclear because some of them were issued earlier under other people's names. And so do we want to count those as John Coltrane official releases? And you know, on some level they are. You know, Tanganyika Strut under Wilbur Hardin's name is Dial Africa, I believe, on a much later release under Coltrane's name. But Wilbur Hardin's certainly a name that's gotten forgotten, and Coltrane's going to sell more records. So it's, you know, it's a business thing as much as it is anything else. But we certainly wouldn't consider Tanganyika Strut, which was on Savoy, to be Coltrane's pinnacle. And it's a tough thing to decide the highest peak in a mountain range when so many moments pierce the clouds. And it's really even interesting how different each of those pinnacle peaks are. They're not all the same mountain range. They're very different fundamentally in a lot of different ways. And so you look at his body of work as a sideman, where he's actually a strong influencer as a sideman. I've also said Sonny Clark, Sonny's Crib is one of the greatest records ever. And of course, Sonny always has that leadership of his own. But when you have Coltrane on a record with you, and again, you have to remember, Coltrane's not this established giant as we think of him today. And he was, you know, certainly ascending. He'd played with Miles at that point. So he was a decent sized name. But he's certainly elevated in our modern day representation of jazz, just as Miles is, possibly more deservedly so than Miles. But they're both so highly elevated in terms of their share of the jazz marketplace today. You know, they were parts of a working body, and they've become two of the major limbs now. Whereas before they were literally fingers or arteries, like they were small pieces of a huge kingdom. And now we see them as the left and right hand of jazz, which I think is very much untrue, and none of the metrics really support that analysis or that conclusion. So you look at his side work, though, there's some impressive stuff in that era. But we certainly wouldn't consider any of his pinnacle stuff. But he was definitely a strong contributor as a sideman during those years, going back to Bostic and Dizzy Gillespie, and he was very much a background figure in those eras. And it's certainly his work with Miles that's elevating him in the jazz community. But Miles is kind of on a comeback path of his own. Miles' career is kind of much misseen today. The Birth of the Cool wasn't this huge thing when it happened. It comes out very intermittently on 78s and then 10 inches, and it wasn't really celebrated or seen as this important figure in the era of jazz and modern jazz and third stream and all those things. It wasn't Capitol didn't really promote it that hard, and it wasn't until Miles Davis's career takes off, really at Columbia, where Capitol says, you know what, that session we did back in the late 40s, he's on all three of those sessions, along with Mulligan and Connitz and the whole crew, J.J. Johnson, Kenny Clark. That's a pretty amazing ensemble of musicians at that point, Lee Connitz. But I think Capitol issues it. You got 58 or 62 in there. There's a couple different issues of it, if I remember. And it's kind of become this, in hindsight, we think of it as Miles' first kind of pinnacle, but it really wasn't. It was a little hill. And of course, he's working with Parker and Gillespie before that. And even there, he's kind of an underling. So Miles really doesn't ascend until 55. You know, so the idea that he was kind of, his career was a bit of a recession in 52, 53, 54. There are some eras where he's kind of seeking his direction, but he comes back to those eras intermittently. Arguably 60, 61, he is intermittent and trying to find his direction again. You know, so it's not uncommon for Miles to kind of be looking at his compass going, which way do I go? And so Miles in 55 is ascending. You know, the Newport Jazz Festival of Akian sees him and just is like, okay, this kid, he's back. And I think Miles had just gotten sober, which is probably part of his ferocity and connection to the audience and playing with a kind of energy that he doesn't often play with from what I've read about that day. It's an ensemble piece with, it wasn't a working band on stage. It was a bunch of all-stars on stage. And it's a setting where Miles would have often been kind of subservient, but instead he kind of really just lurches forward and establishes himself and gets signed to Columbia, which is one of the great changes in course of any jazz career of all time. And at that same time, of course, he's been developing his first quintet with Coltrane and Red Garland and Philly Joe Jones and Paul Chambers. And that first quintet is at the right place at the right time to kind of lift both guys to a new level. And so you have Coltrane and Miles both kind of exploding on the scene in terms of becoming more even mainstream to the mass of America. But again, jazz has really slipped in its status by this point. You know, the dominating of the charts in the 30s, that was gone. Jazz was losing its ground to rock and roll, early rockabilly, you know what I mean, early rhythm and blues. Louis Jordan had owned the charts in the 40s. Rhythm and blues had really taken over the race record charts, as they were called in those days. It was just a different time for jazz. But Miles and Coltrane definitely kind of re-bring a broader audience through the distribution of Columbia. And so when Coltrane goes out on his own, because he has a hard time kicking the drugs, and Miles doesn't want to be around it anymore. He works with Monk in 58, and Monk shapes him greatly. And there's not an album that they made per se. There is a live recording at Carnegie Hall. And I think Jazzland has some outtakes, maybe from that same thing, Monk and Coltrane. But they weren't really a working band. They just played together for a minute. And Monk was a real developmental point in Coltrane's direction. And before Monk, it was kind of that sheets of sound, endless notes, just ripping into that saxophone for quite a long time, extended verses that would just go on without any conciseness. You know, I mean, he didn't refine it. It was all just part of the melee. The canvas got all the paint. And as Coltrane gets redirected by Monk, Monk's ideations are sometimes about minimalism and finding the right chunks, the right colors, the right little blotches of paint to get that effect. What I always say about Monk is like a cat walking across a piano. Chung, 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 chung. You know what I mean? That's Monk. That distillation of sound into its finite essential things. And I think Ahmad Jamal had a big impact on Miles in that way. Count Basie impacted a lot of people that way with minimalism. And of course, we see it here again. And so Coltrane post-Monk. So we could pretty much exclude everything before Monk as being Coltrane's pinnacle. That's part of my process here. So we're just doing this together. I'm sharing my process. And there's some great stuff in there. The Believer, Black Pearls, The Lush Life, which I do love that a lot. His debut record. But you got to kind of say, okay, yeah. And then Blue Train happens in there, and that's probably his first pinnacle. And I think it happens in early 50, mid 57. And it's a great session, and it cooks. It's blistering hard Blue Note sound. And if you want to put a finger on what Blue Train is, it's the prototypical Blue Note hard bop sound. It's not Coltrane sound. Because if you listen to Coltrane, what he's doing simultaneously at Prestige, it's a different beast. Prestige doesn't really have parameters or oversight. It's just kind of guys showing up and blowing and doing whatever you want to do pretty much. And if Weinstock liked it, he put it out. If he didn't, he erased it. That was kind of how Prestige worked. Blue Note was much more finite, much more arranged, rehearsed, discussed, overall arching sound, tempo, colors, and vibes. And as I said before, that rehearsal time allows you to spend a couple days together to commune, to talk, to drink, to smoke, to break. All that stuff allows us to talk and share commonalities and spiritualities and consciousness. And so suddenly now when we're back in that room playing again, we're reissuing and echoing thoughts and conversations and opinions and our spirituality back to and forth to each other now, because we've been informed by conversation and dialogue and spending time together. So it changes how you sound with someone when you know them well, or when you even get to know them over a few days, rehearsing, talking the current affairs. It allows you to have a communion and a fellowship and to speak as one through your recordings, which Blue Note really nails. And so you didn't really record for Blue Note in 56, 57, 58, and not end up being part of a hard bop session. You didn't get that choice. That's just where you were. You were at a hard bop session. And so Blue Train is a great record, but it's not a Coltrane thing. It's a Blue Note thing. And Lee Morgan and Curtis Fuller and the whole company on that record are as important and as integral to the sound of that pulsing anger and frustration of Black America as Coltrane was. It's a group thing. So you got to kind of say Blue Train's not the pinnacle. Monk comes in the picture, and Coltrane does dabble with Miles again off and on here. Some of that early Miles Columbia work is some of Coltrane's finest work, honestly. But we're going to dive forward into Atlantic. And my favorite things is a really important song. You wouldn't say the record has that same oomph as the title track, which is kind of ubiquitous. My favorite things by John Coltrane is the kind of song that your girlfriend knows. And she doesn't just know from the sound of music. She knows because she's heard in Borders books. My favorite things by John Coltrane. And of course, it would be the edited 7-inch version, so it's only 3.5 minutes, not the full 8 or 10 or whatever it is. But it's still a commonality. But the rest of the record doesn't seem to have that same prestige and seminal awareness. So I would not say it's going to be my favorite things. And then you have Giant Steps. And Giant Steps is a tornado of sound. It's a lot of numbers and math and music theory. The circle of fifths and all that as it unfolds, and as he's playing through the changes, and Flanagan and the company can't keep up with him. It's a pulsing, intense experience, and Atlantic is allowing a lot of real free creativity at this point. So there's not a lot of interference at Atlantic. I love the sound of the Atlantic records. Some people criticize Tom Dowd. I think those records sound great. And of course, Atlantic was moving more towards rhythm and blues, so that was always going to be their focus. And so, but I think the bass and the drums are always really strong sounding on those Atlantic records myself, and that's the part of the pulse of the rhythm and the blues for sure. But you have to really look at Giant Steps and say, okay, this is going to be one of his pinnacles, because he takes numbers and theory and makes it very accessible, which is kind of shocking. It's kind of shocking how you can take something that's really unnatural in a sense and make it sound so comfortable and natural to us. That's a skill set of its own. And Giant Steps has so many great records on their Spiral, Countdown, Mr. PC. All those tracks just have this incredible pulse. And I've often compared it to Slayer's Seasons in the Abyss. It's like 32 minutes of, just a real ferocious record. So Giant Steps, I think, is in the mix. When we move forward through his Atlantic years, he's already kind of getting ready to go to Impulse. And of course, Creed Taylor brings him over there on the hopes that he can recapture My Favorite Things. Something's going to be a hit. And Coltrane had little interest in regurgitating My Favorite Things. It was something he kind of did and was done with. So he comes to Atlantic and does Africa Brass with Dolphy and company. And it was such not a thing that Creed Taylor wanted that actually got pushed back a little bit in terms of release. And so his big star artist wasn't one of the first 4 records issued simultaneously. He had to wait till was it 7? Impulse 7? Is that 6 maybe? Africa Brass. And it was a challenging record. But in the next 20 records or so at Impulse, he releases Live at the Village Vanguard, which is just a seminal piece. It's forceful, it's spiritual. I'm going to use another church word. It's kind of anointed. It feels like a very holy mission. And it's intense. It's as intense really as you can get because there's a sincerity to it. And the sincerity of John Coltrane, for me, is why I can sit through some of his sessions that are more difficult that I would never spend my time listening to by most of his followers. And that's where I got to kind of with the avant-garde, with free jazz. I loved Coltrane's spirituality and intensity and dedication and sincerity so strongly that most of the other guys who came along, it just felt very much loose attempt to copy something that was doing successful in jazz circles. And even Pharoah Sanders, who influences Coltrane, no doubt, I still feel very much is riding Coltrane's coattails and springboards it into a successful career with the hippies and the alt scene. And again, it's a white audience buying Pharoah Sanders. Let's just be clear about that. It was those records didn't sell in the neighborhoods. They were being sold to white college kids doing LSD, listening to the Grateful Dead. That made sense to them. And that's true for a lot of Coltrane's Impulse work. When you get to Kula Samama and Om and Ascension, those are difficult records. Live at the Village Vanguard, again, difficult records. And it takes a kind of a dedication and a want to be there to kind of, if you got a frustration in your day and you're tackling some issues that are really kind of wearing you, those records can actually be helpful. You can put them on and kind of work through some shit. If you're having a good day, a positive day, a bright day, those records can be really intense and more than you bargained for. And I shy away from them. I don't listen to them very much anymore, obviously. But I'm also almost 50 years old. So I do enjoy those records once in a while. And I'll certainly put on Kula Se Mama before I'll play most of the other stuff in the free avant-garde world. I love a record like that with some African kind of pulses in there and cultural world sounds going on, borrowing from what Yusuf Lateef had kind of brought to the scene. So Coltrane really was a real chameleon. He really could graft a lot of things into his sound. But Coltrane comes out shortly after that by like Impulse 21, I think it is. And that first Coltrane record's a strong session, kind of more middle of the road. And then he follows it up with my favorites by him, ballads, Ellington, and with Hartman. And I would say Ellington and Hartman, those two records especially, ballads right there, are two of my favorite Coltrane records. And I would love to put them as pinnacle pieces. And there's certainly high points in the range. But I think I would take a lot of grief from a lot of people if I said Ellington or the Hartman record were Coltrane's legacy records, which of course moves us on to Crescent and A Love Supreme. And again, it's a tough call. Crescent's a masterpiece, so spiritually intense. Love Supreme, again, it's not going to be for everyone, but it's a spiritual pleading with the cosmos. And what I love about these records, what I love about Coltrane's spirituality, is that he's consciously making it not about one religion or belief system. He's consciously making, by the titles of the records, he's saying there needs to be a global human consciousness, a global human spirituality. You don't name the records that he named what he did without having interstellar space. You know what I mean? When you start having these cosmic names to your records, selflessness, you're not adhering to one historical piece of human history. You're trying to amalgamate all of it into one belief system, which is what Coltrane is about. And so Love Supreme, Crescent, they're obviously peaks in the Coltrane mountain range as well. So having gone through, and there's Coltrane, of course, continues on up until his death with Expression, and then there's just a litany of stuff that comes out posthumously. Then they still unearth Coltrane stuff to this day, as we've seen stuff put out the last few years quite consistently still. The Village Vanguard the Village Vanguard complete box, which I only have on CD. I don't know if it's ever been on vinyl. Probably has been nowadays. I think that's as intense and as spiritual as you can dive into Coltrane, Village Vanguard. And I'm nudging Village Vanguard towards the top of my Coltrane list, which I'm a little surprised by, but I think it's such a great crossroads. And I think it's such a great moment with everything he's done before interceding with everything he's about to become. And there's still melody and there's still contemplation. So I pulled it out, Live at the Village Vanguard. And Dolphy's still on this. You got Reggie Workman on the bass still, along with McCoy and Elvin. And Softly as the Morning Sunrise, Spiritual, Chasing the Train. And again, Chasing the Train, there's versions of that will melt your skull. And so it's between that. I do want to give an honorable mention to Impressions, which I think is a wonderful, wonderful session. He's on the soprano sax quite a lot on this one. These old Impulse are beautiful old war horses, and are certainly notable, wonderful pieces to own. But it's between Village Vanguard and Live at Birdland. And Live at Birdland is such an important record, in no small part because of Alabama. And Alabama is just this moody contemplation of racism. And it's poignant, it's timeless, it's spiritual, it's sears the soul some. And it's an instrumental accompaniment to the same gut feeling you get listening to Strange Fruit by Billie Holiday. When Billie sings Strange Fruit and just makes your skin uncomfortable and clammy and just hurts, that legacy and that history is alive in Alabama. And Coltrane is obviously unimpressed with the politics and the situations that are happening in the American South. And he, of course, was a Carolinian himself, so he's got the South in his blood. And again, that story of Black America and that migration out of the South and Jim Crow and all the events that shape jazz in the 50s and 60s, it can't be ignored. It can't be understated. It has to be contemplated in your listening. If you're listening to Alabama or Impressions or Village Vanguard again, and you're not thinking of the plight of the black male in America in the 30s, 40s, and the 50s into the 60s, again, you're not feeling the story. You're missing the entire plot. And again, that's part of my issue with the audiophile thing when I talk about that sometimes. It's like there's this incredible documentation of American history being spoken on these records, and you're going to do a 20-minute video about this record and not discuss that? You're not going to mention the resistance that music was about and how powerful it was? I'm at a loss. And I can see right now in my own viewfinder here that this is recording backwards, so I guess I didn't fix it. Hopefully I can remember to fix it in editing this time. I got to put a little note on my computer so I don't ever forget. I don't know what it is. I don't know why my phone is... Again, my phone died 6 weeks ago. And I never let my phone die. But it died, did a bunch of updates, and I turned it back on. And ever since then, every time I film, it does this, flips it backwards. Mirror image or something. And I've tried to look on Google, even like little videos, but I've not been able to figure it out. So, and my wife's been trying to get the time to help me with it, but she's been so busy, and I hate to bug her when she comes home after a 12, 13-hour day. So I got to remember to fix it in editing. Last, I want to say, if you want to make an episode contribution to episode number 500, where you just mention and talk about what you love about jazz, what your favorite jazz is, what this channel has meant to you, put a little 2-3 minute video together and send it to me. You can send it through Facebook Messenger. You can send it through, I think, Dropbox. I think I have a few apps on my phone where people have sent me videos before. I'm super not fluent in the language of this stuff. But there's an email address that you can send it to. So if you want to put something together, message me somehow. Either in the comments, I'll see it, through the email at vanally@yahoo.com, which I'll try to remember to put that in the link below. But I'd love to get your contributions to the 500th episode, and do a little montage of people's thoughts and opinions on it all. So Coltrane, undoubtedly a star and a real important part of civil rights, and a guy who let the music do his walking and his talking. He didn't need lyricists. He didn't need lyrics. The only song record he did with the singer was with Johnny Hartman, and that was pretty much at the behest of Impulse, saying, hey man, we're giving you a good contract here. Make some records we can sell. Because let's be clear, Impulse knew a lot of what Coltrane wanted to do wasn't going to sell. And it's since found its audience and it's proved its worth and its value, but it's not commercially accessible stuff. And Impulse wasn't this entity on its own. It was part of ABC, which is part of this huge economic empire. And Impulse was a risk that they were taking as jazz sales were declining rapidly. But the idea of we're going to sign John Coltrane away from Atlantic was part of the coup that convinces the head guys at ABC to let Creed Taylor do Impulse. And so he does manage to give them some records that were accessible, and his body of work stood the test of time, especially 61 through 64 or so, the great quartet years. And then 65 was this incredible nexus of a lot of different things happening. And then eventually the quartet ends in 65 by the end of the year, and new people have kind of come into the group, Rashid Ali and Pharoah Saunders, and eventually Alice Coltrane. But these records by him are all important parts of the jazz canon, and they're even the best way probably to get into free jazz and some of the more avant-garde sounds, because again, his sincerity always keeps it on point. So appreciate you guys. If you want to support the channel, subscribe, hit the like button, go to my Patreon page if you want to support it with a small pledge every month. If you want to buy a t-shirt or a hoodie, it's in the description below. Again, get your videos to me if you want to comment on what you feel about the channel and what you appreciate and love about jazz the most. Talk to y'all soon. Peace.